A peaceful afternoon in the suburbs of Savannah suddenly turned into a nightmare when two strangers in tactical armor, calling themselves the HOA Enforcement Division, knocked on the door and forced Malcolm Reed, a black man, to leave his home within 48 hours. But Malcolm was not the kind of man to bow easily. What he didn't expect was that, just minutes later, 3 familiar SUVs would pull up, carrying 6 former SEALs, brothers who had once stood with him on the battlefield. The entire neighborhood held its breath, and then what happened next left everyone stunned. Malcolm Reed was used to the quiet rhythm of an afternoon in the suburbs of Savannah. After a long day of work, he returned to his home with a familiar sense of comfort. The brick walls and weathered wooden porch stood as proof of years of hard work. But that evening, a single knock on the door was enough to shatter the peace he treasured. It wasn't the polite knock of a neighbor, nor the hurried rapping of urgent news. It was 3 firm, commanding thuds that echoed like an order. Malcolm froze, instinct telling him that whatever waited on the other side of that door was far from ordinary. When he opened it, 2 unfamiliar faces appeared. Both were clad in tactical armor, badges stitched with the words HOA Enforcement Division. Their voices were rigid, demanding that he vacate his home within 48 hours for alleged violations of community rules. Malcolm stared at them, the corner of his mouth twitching into a faint, sardonic smile. He knew well he owed nothing, nor had he violated any covenant. This home had been paid off years ago, with every legal document in his possession. What unsettled him was not their claim, but their presence. No notice, no legitimate paperwork, only an air of intimidation that felt more like a strike team than neighborhood oversight. He accepted the paper they handed him, skimming through the hollow lines. Instantly, he spotted the irregularities. No seal, no signature, no legitimate names from the HOA board. The document looked like a rushed printout pulled from the internet. Malcolm lifted his gaze, locking onto the cold, mirrored lenses of the shorter man's glasses, then onto the scar carved into the taller man's brow. A sharp, mocking smile spread across his face as he spoke slowly, each word deliberate. "You really think a vest and a few forged papers are enough to drive me out of my own house?" The silence that followed was suffocating. They stood there, eyes defiant, but Malcolm knew with certainty now, these men were no legal representatives of the HOA. This was a calculated scheme. His instincts told him to stand his ground, because from the very moment that door swung open, he understood this was no ordinary harassment. This was the beginning of something far more dangerous. The moment of silence slipped by before the taller man with the scar on his brow leaned in, his voice dropping low but carrying an unmistakable edge. "We didn't come here to argue. This is the final decision. Leave quietly and things stay simple. Resist and we'll be forced to take stronger measures." His words were more than a threat. They were calculated, a psychological tactic meant to sow doubt. Malcolm stood tall, meeting their gaze, his breathing steady. In his mind echoed his father's words, "When someone tries to scare you, it's because they fear their own truth." The shorter one cut in, his tone sharp and icy, piling on details as if to assert authority. "Do you know what happens when you're blacklisted by the HOA? You won't be able to sell your house, won't qualify for insurance, and everything you've built here will crumble. Best to walk away now and avoid the trouble." Malcolm tilted his head slightly, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. They weren't just flexing false power, they were trying to hit where it hurt most: finances, the universal pressure point for any homeowner. Clearly, these weren't amateurs. They had studied how to prey on human fear. Malcolm didn't rush to answer. Slowly, he lifted the forged document in front of them and pointed to the header. An upside-down logo, clumsy wording, even spelling errors. "This is the evidence you plan to use against me? Laughable." The mockery in his tone shook them for a moment. But the scarred one forced himself to stay rigid, growling, "You're making this harder on yourself. We have authority." Malcolm cut him off at once. Authority? Real authority doesn't need to pretend. The harder you try to prove it, the clearer it becomes. You're nothing but a farce. In that instant, Malcolm stepped back, not in surrender, but to get a clearer view. His eyes flicked to the doorbell camera beside him, then out toward the street. A black SUV sat parked, its plates covered with dark tape. A chill ran down his spine. This wasn't spontaneous. It was staged. He noticed someone inside the vehicle tapping rapidly on a tablet, the glow reflecting off the glass. This wasn't random harassment. It was an operation, with someone directing it from afar. Malcolm's phone buzzed. He picked up. On the line, a woman's voice claimed to be an HOA secretary, insisting the eviction order was legitimate and he must comply. But the audio wavered, her tone shaky, metallic echoes bouncing as if from an empty room. At one point, she even stumbled over his last name. Malcolm smirked. Another weak prop in their theater of deception. He didn't hang up. He put the call on speaker, letting the two men hear their supposed allies' clumsy performance. When the call ended with a long, empty dial tone, Malcolm folded his phone and said evenly, "Even your own people can't remember my name, and you think you can force me out of this house?" The imposters began to crack. The shorter man exhaled sharply, ripping off his mirrored glasses to reveal bloodshot eyes strained with tension. Desperate to regain the upper hand, he pulled out a folder, flipping through photos of Malcolm's home. But the images were blatantly doctored. Trash scattered across a lawn, peeling paint on walls, a cracked porch. "This is proof of your violations," he declared firmly. Malcolm laughed outright, shaking his head. "My walls were painted last week, and your edits are sloppy enough to leave cut marks. You insult not only my intelligence, but this entire community." Outside, curtains shifted. Neighbors peeked through windows, their worried eyes darting between the men and Malcolm. No one stepped out, but fear rippled across the block. Malcolm felt it heavy in the air. He knew their silence wasn't indifference, it was dread. Speaking up might put them next on the list. Inside him, a fire of resolve ignited. He couldn't let these imposters corner him, not for his home and not for the community. If he bowed now, they'd return, spreading fear to more families. He stared the men down, his voice rising like a challenge. "You might fool others, but you knocked on the wrong door. I am not the man who bows in silence." In that moment, fear had no place. Only a tension like a drawn bowstring, quivering before release. Malcolm knew with certainty this was only the beginning. The air on Malcolm Reed's porch thickened, as if every breath slowed under its weight. The two imposters stood across from him, eyes narrowed, clinging desperately to their crumbling facade of authority. But Malcolm had seen through the deception from the start, and the more he exposed it, the more rattled they became. Instead of retreating, they grew more aggressive, knowing that if they lost control now, their entire scheme would collapse. The scarred man jabbed a finger at Malcolm, spitting each word. "You think you're clever? Don't believe a few twisted questions change anything. We're not here to debate, we're here to carry out a mission." But Malcolm didn't flinch. He stepped down from the porch, holding the forged paper high so the neighbors peeking through curtains could see. "This is all they have," he shouted, his voice echoing across the street. "A worthless sheet of paper. No seal, no signature, no accountability." His words hung in the air like a public verdict. The imposters hesitated, but the stocky one yanked off his mirrored glasses, defiance flashing in his eyes. He pulled another stack of papers from a folder and thrust them forward. You want proof? Here's proof. Multiple violations, trash on the lawn, unpermitted repairs, degrading neighborhood aesthetics. He slapped down a photo of Malcolm's house, the yard cluttered, the walls peeling. Malcolm studied it, a smirk tugging at his lips. Sloppy work. The tree in this photo hasn't even grown leaves yet, while outside it's full and green. This picture was patched together from last season. And I repainted my walls just last week. Lies like this don't stand. At that moment, a faint buzzing drew Malcolm's eyes skyward. A drone hovered above his roof, its red light casting eerie flashes across the lawn. Someone was recording the entire encounter. Suddenly, it was clear. This wasn't improvised. It was orchestrated, equipped with tech, with oversight from somewhere else. The SUV across the street confirmed it. Through its tinted glass, a tablet glowed, hands moving furiously over the screen. Malcolm's chest tightened. He was being watched, targeted like a pawn in a larger game. The imposters sensed his awareness. The scarred man sneered, voice sharp. You can't win. Behind us is a system. The HOA never shows mercy. Malcolm's reply boomed, for both them and the neighbors frozen behind their curtains. If you had a system, why hide in an SUV? Why wave fake papers? Why cover your plates? Real power doesn't hide its face. Just then, the door of house number 14 swung open. Elderly Mrs. Hadley stumbled out, clutching a phone with trembling hands. "Malcolm, what's happening?" she gasped. Before she could step forward, her knees buckled and she collapsed on the walkway. A child screamed, "Mrs. Hadley!" Panic surged down the block. Neighbors rushed to help her, while the imposters tried to seize the distraction, stepping onto Malcolm's porch. But Malcolm's arm shot out, blocking them, eyes blazing. "One step closer, and you won't be facing just me." His words had barely fallen when headlights cut through the street. 3 black SUVs rumbled in, engines growling. Malcolm drew in a breath as 6 familiar silhouettes emerged. Jonah Mercer's razor gaze, Marcus Doyle's cold grin, Pierce Vaughn's iron stance, Damian Holt's calm presence, Silas Rowan's watchful eyes, and Kessler Grant's steady stride. 6 former SEALs, his brothers in arms, had arrived. The street held its breath. Neighbors who once only dared peek through curtains now stepped outside, phones raised. The imposters stiffened, scrambling to maintain posture. The scarred one snapped, "This doesn't concern you. Stand down." Jonas stepped forward, voice low and steady. "The second you set foot on this porch, it concerned all of us." Silas tilted his head at their pristine tactical gear, smirking. Brand new, stitching still clean. Real gear doesn't shine like that. Marcus snatched the forged paper from Malcolm, waving it before the crowd. And this? A printout from the internet? Looks like a teenager's homework excuse. Laughter rippled through the neighbors, tension shifting into shared outrage. Then, without warning, the streetlights went dark. The block plunged into suffocating blackness, lit only by phone screens and SUV headlights. A shiver ran through the crowd. The scarred man used the cover to step back, whispering into a radio. Malcolm strained to listen, but Jonah's hand shot up, signaling calm. "Hold position," he warned. "They're testing our nerves." When the lights flickered back on, the air was heavier, the crowd larger. Phones recorded from every angle, flashes reflecting in determined eyes. Malcolm stood in their center, friends at his side, neighbors rallying around, his voice rising like a battle cry. "They're imposters. No HOA sends armored men to your door. Stay silent now, and tomorrow they'll knock on yours. Look at the truth. Don't let fear rule you." The imposters faltered, their confidence crumbling under the glare of witnesses. Uneasy glances passed between them, but they refused to yield. The standoff had reached its breaking point, every second vibrating with the promise of confrontation. And Malcolm knew the real fight had only just begun. The beams from 3 SUVs swept across the Savannah street, glinting off old brick walls and empty porches. Engines rumbled low, then cut, leaving behind a silence heavy with tension. One by one, 6 towering figures stepped out. For a heartbeat, the world seemed frozen. Neighbors held their breath, phones recording, screens casting anxious light onto wide eyes. Jonah Mercer moved first. His dark coat shifted with each step, eyes sharp as blades as he scanned the imposters. That gaze alone pressed the air heavy. Beside him, Marcus Doyle curled a half-smile, less amusement, more disdain for reckless pretenders. Pierce Vaughn strode firmly, hands in his pockets but eyes hard as steel. Damian Holt followed at a measured pace, every movement carrying the weight of battle-tested calm. Silas Rowan stayed quiet, gaze dissecting details like a scanner. Last was Kessler Grant, shoulders broad as a wall, moving forward with the force of a closed gate. The impostors stiffened instantly. The scarred man furrowed his brow, voice straining for control, though it trembled at the edges. "This doesn't concern you. This is an internal HOA matter." Jonah raised an eyebrow, his voice deep and steady. "The HOA I know doesn't send men in armor. It doesn't show up at dusk to threaten families out of their homes. The second you set foot on this porch, it concerned all of us." Marcus stepped forward, snatching the paper Malcolm had held. He raised it high for the gathered crowd. "This," he growled, "is a joke. No seal, no signature, just a cheap printout any kid could download." He tore it in half and let the scraps fall onto the lawn. The ripping sound cracked the night, sharp as a blade cutting through lies. A few neighbors murmured, some even laughed in scorn. Silas tilted his head, stripping the impostors bare with his words. "Brand new armor, stitching untouched, not a mark of real field use. That radio isn't even on. Your gear isn't equipment, it's a costume." Damian crossed his arms, his tone calm but cutting. "You speak of power, but real power is written in law and regulation, not in cheap theater." The impostors faltered, glancing toward the black SUV. Inside, the tablet's glow flickered, fingers typing frantically. But the arrival of the SEALs had shattered the script. Fear, not dominance, colored their stance now. Pierce stepped closer, leaving barely a hand's breadth between him and the scarred man. His voice dropped, yet carried for the whole street to hear. "You miscalculated. You thought this was a quiet street where fear kept people bowed. But you chose the wrong place. This is where people don't kneel." From house number 14, a young neighbor who'd been recording in secret now stepped fully outside, phone raised higher. The whispers spread into chatter. The once silent community was awakening, not trembling bystanders anymore, but witnesses ready to expose the truth. Then Kessler Grant spoke, his voice thunderous. "You might fool someone standing alone, but you can't fool a community that stands together." A ripple of applause broke from the porches, at first scattered, then swelling, wave after wave. The stodgy imposter bit his lip, eyes burning as he tried to salvage control. "You don't know what you're up against. We have protection. One report from us and this whole street will be blacklisted." Jonah chuckled, short and bitter. "A blacklist from who? An organization that doesn't exist? You've just admitted you're nothing but grifters peddling fear." Malcolm stepped up then, standing shoulder to shoulder with his brothers. Around him, neighbors crowded closer, their phone lights like a forest of fireflies. He drew a deep breath, his voice echoing. "You thought you could scare me, but you forgot. I don't stand alone. This is my home and theirs too. Taking down one man might be easy, but breaking a whole community? You chose the wrong game. The air tightened like a drawn bowstring, but the strength had shifted. The impostors, who had arrived cloaked in false authority, now looked small under the weight of unity. Their eyes flickered with doubt. One whispered, "We should pull back," but the scarred leader cut him off, forcing a show of defiance. Then the streetlights flickered and died again. Darkness swallowed the block. Hearts clenched. But this time, fear did not rule. The glow of phone screens stayed bright, cameras fixed on the imposters. No shadow could cover the truth anymore. In that moment, Malcolm felt a surge of power, not just from the brothers flanking him, but from the collective will of neighbors refusing to bend. He glanced at Jonah and gave a single nod. Jonah understood. He stepped forward, voice booming like a verdict. "This circus ends now. You have two choices. Leave quietly or stay and face the truth that every single person here can see." The street pulsed with the rhythm of pounding hearts, but doubt was gone. Everyone knew the balance had shifted. In Malcolm's proud eyes and in the solidarity surrounding him, the truth was clear. Real strength was never in false armor, but in brotherhood, and in a community that no force could break. The Savannah street had become a stage of pure tension, every glance and every breath fixed on the clash between two forces. On one side stood the impostors, clinging desperately to the last scraps of false authority. On the other, Malcolm, his SEAL brothers, and dozens of neighbors who were slowly finding their courage. No more shuttered windows, no more furtive stares. Neighbors were stepping forward, forming a circle of solidarity. The scarred man bit his lip, growling, "You think just standing together is enough? You have no idea who we're working for. This isn't a game." But his voice shook, stripped of its earlier certainty. Malcolm locked eyes with him, fire blazing. "I know exactly who the joke is. You. You're not the law. You're not the HOA. You're frauds in borrowed costumes." His words drew a roar from the crowd. Neighbors shouted back, "That's right, fakes!" Cornered, the stocky imposter yanked a stack of files from his bag. Paper scattered, and Malcolm bent quickly to pick one up. In the glow of phone lights, familiar names leapt from the page. His neighbors, complete with addresses. A wave of outrage rippled through the crowd. This wasn't just about Malcolm. They had planned to target the whole community. From her chair, frail Mrs. Hadley raised a trembling voice. "If Malcolm gives in, tomorrow it'll be our turn." Her words struck like a spark, igniting the block. Before the imposters could react, the streetlights died. Darkness smothered the street, thick and suffocating. Only the glow of dozens of phones lit the scene, shaky light spilling over tense faces. Malcolm clenched his fists, but this time without fear. He knew now, darkness hid nothing. The community had awakened. Jonah's hand rose, signaling the SEALs to hold steady. Pierce stepped forward, his voice sharp as steel. "What's your plan in the dark? To run? To scare us again? Too late. This whole street already knows the truth." Applause cracked the silence, spreading like wildfire. When the streetlights flared back to life, the imposters were exposed more than ever. The scarred man clenched his fists, ready to move, but Kessler loomed in front of him, immovable as a wall. Damien's calm, heavy voice cut through. "One more step, and you'll bury yourselves. Every second is being recorded. Let's see how the cameras tell this story." Whispers rose in the crowd. More phones lifted, flashes strobing like lightning. The hunters had become the prey, trapped under the glare of truth and collective justice. Somewhere, a child cried out, clutched tight in his mother's arms. The sound pierced the night, raw and painful, but it also reminded everyone what was truly at stake: homes, trust, the safety of their children. Malcolm turned, voice ringing clear. "We're not resisting this scam for ourselves alone. We're standing for the next generation. If we stay silent today, tomorrow it'll be our children they come for." "Exactly!" voices roared back, surging with fury. The imposters exchanged panicked looks. The stocky one muttered, "We should pull back." But the scarred leader snarled, "Not yet. We're not done." He raised his clipboard like a weapon, but Silas stepped in, eyes cold enough to freeze him mid-motion. "Don't be stupid. That won't save you." Marcus sneered, his voice cutting like a blade. "The only thing left to you is your tattered pride, and even that's unraveling before the whole neighborhood." Then, from the distance, sirens wailed. Blue and red lights flickered at the end of the street. Neighbors shouted, pointing, cheering as squad cars rolled closer. The scarred man's eyes bulged, his hands trembling despite his forced scowl. "You'll regret this," he spat, but his words drowned beneath the thunder of clapping and triumphant cries. Malcolm took one final step forward, standing tall in the flood of headlights and flashing beacons. His voice rang louder than ever. "No, it's you who will regret it. You underestimated the strength of truth. You underestimated the courage of this community. And tonight, you lost." As the cruisers pulled in, tires grinding on pavement, the street erupted. Tension, long wound tight, snapped, not into violence, but into unity, into the light of dozens of phones and the roar of hundreds of hearts. In the strobing blue and red glow, the imposters shrank, rigid and pale. No longer enforcers, no longer predators, only frauds exposed, small before justice and the power of solidarity. And Malcolm knew this night would be etched forever into the community's memory as a lesson written in fire. No shadow can smother the light when people choose to stand together. The wail of patrol sirens tore through the night, blue and red lights flashing across the Savannah street. The imposters, who had strutted so boldly minutes before, now shrank against their black SUV, eyes darting like cornered animals. Officers jumped out, their commanding voices booming. "Hands up! Don't move!" The scarred man froze, raising his hands stiffly, while the stocky one trembled so hard his clipboard slipped from his grasp with a hollow thud. Malcolm quietly stepped back, making way for the ones with real authority. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to threaten anymore. The truth had already spoken. Jonah gave his shoulder a firm pat, his eyes glinting with pride. "You did the right thing," he said simply. But the weight in his voice lifted a burden Malcolm hadn't realized he was carrying. The officers searched the SUV and pulled out piles of props. Brand new armor, radios with no batteries, documents printed off the internet, and even a long list of neighborhood names and addresses. Gasps rippled through the crowd, anger mixing with horror. Mrs. Hadley, steadying herself in a chair, her voice thin but strong, declared, "If Malcolm hadn't stood up, I'd have been next." Her words brought tears to many eyes. Faces once hidden behind curtains now shone with gratitude. As the imposters were cuffed and led away, cheers erupted up and down the block. It wasn't triumph over enemies. It was the release of fear, the relief of light driving out darkness. Children clung to their parents. Neighbors shook hands. Heads nodded toward Malcolm in thanks. But deep down, Malcolm knew this wasn't his victory alone. It was the power of a united community, the strength of brotherhood arriving in time, courage spreading from one heart to many. The next day, Magnolia Hall, the neighborhood's community center, was packed wall to wall. All eyes turned to Malcolm and his SEAL brothers seated in the front row. The real HOA president, Patricia Landon, stepped to the podium. Her voice rang clear. "What happened last night is a warning. The HOA never operates through threats, never sends armored men door to door with fake papers. Those people were scammers. But together, we showed them the strength of a united community. Thunderous applause shook the hall, with many standing, eyes fixed on Malcolm. He rose slowly. "I'm not a hero," he began. "I'm just someone who refused to let fear decide for me. But alone, I wouldn't be standing here today. It was the presence of my brothers and the unity of my neighbors that gave us true strength." He paused, then added, voice thick with emotion, "We don't get to choose when trouble knocks on our door, but we do get to choose how we answer. If we answer together, nothing can defeat us." The hall fell silent for a beat, then erupted in thunderous applause. Some wept openly. Residents proposed forming a neighborhood watch, not to replace police, but to ensure no one ever had to face fear alone again. That night, after everyone had gone, Malcolm sat on his porch, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. The street was peaceful once more, only the sound of crickets filling the air. His mind replayed it all, the ominous knock, the fake papers, the drone overhead, the blackout, and finally the moment his friends and neighbors stood beside him. He realized this house was more than bricks and mortar. It was a symbol of resilience, a place where truth and humanity overcame fear. He smiled faintly, sipped his coffee, and whispered to himself, "Real authority doesn't come from armor or fake badges. It comes from truth, from courage, and from unity." The warm glow from inside his home spilled across the porch, lighting his face in peace. And in that moment he knew, no matter what challenges came tomorrow, as long as the community stood together, no imposter force could ever shake them. In life, we don't always get to choose which challenges come knocking, but we do get to choose how we face them. When someone stands alone, fear can easily take over. But when a community stands together, even the darkest night will fade. True strength doesn't come from force or fake authority. It comes from courage, truth, and unity. Believe this. Every time we dare to rise for what's right, we not only protect ourselves, but also spark hope and light for everyone around us. If this story reminds you that real power doesn't lie in fake armor or threats, but in courage and the solidarity of a community, hit that subscribe button now. More moving stories and powerful messages are waiting for you to discover. Thanks for listening.